I have kept this story inside me for over 30 years. And the reason I never told it wasn't because I was afraid. It was because I wasn't sure anyone would believe that 23 children, none of whom ever compared drawings, none of whom sat near each other during the activity, all sketched the exact same place. The same crumbling stone archway, the same broken iron gate, the same hollow deep inside the Halrow Forest that no adult in that village would ever acknowledge existed. And when I asked those children how they knew about it, every single one of them went completely silent. Not the silence of children caught doing something wrong. Something older than that. Something they had been carrying without fully understanding what it was. By the end of what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand something I wish I had understood much sooner. The greatest danger was never the place itself. It was the silence that had been slowly swallowing its history for 50 years. To understand why I asked those children such an ordinary question, I need to take you back to the autumn I arrived in the village of Denmore. I was 34 years old. I had been a teaching sister with the Order of the Sacred Heart for 11 years by then, and I had asked to be stationed somewhere rural, somewhere I could feel genuinely useful. I was not dramatic about my faith. I wasn't the kind of woman who looked for miracles or signs. I believed in patience. I believed in sitting quietly and letting people speak at their own pace. And I believed, deeply and without any hesitation, that children almost always noticed things adults had trained themselves to stop seeing. Denmore was a small community tucked between forested hills and a slow river that turned almost black in the winter months. There were maybe 300 residents, weathered stone farmhouses, an old grain mill that hadn't operated in decades, a narrow bridge with carvings worn smooth by generations of hands, and a church that was older than anyone could accurately document. It was the kind of place that felt permanent, like it had always been there and always would be. I taught the village school, which held children between 6 and 13, 23 students total. I loved them immediately. They were curious and sharp and a little wild in the way that children are when they've grown up with forests and fields instead of sidewalks. But there was something else about them I noticed almost immediately, a kind of quiet weight. Not sadness exactly, more like the look children get when they know something they were told not to repeat. I assumed it was nothing. I was new. Children always observe strangers carefully. The drawing activity happened 6 weeks after I arrived. It was a Friday afternoon, and I simply wanted to understand them better. I asked each child to draw the place that made them feel the most afraid. I was expecting dark bedrooms, deep river water, maybe the old mill. I collected the drawings at the end of class without looking at them immediately. That evening, alone in the schoolroom, I spread them across my desk. My hands stopped moving when I reached the fourth one, then the seventh. By the 15th, I was standing, leaning over the desk, looking from drawing to drawing with a feeling I can only describe as a slow electrical current moving up my spine. Every drawing showed the same place, a stone archway draped in overgrowth, a broken iron gate with a particular shape at its center, something like a flattened cross inside a circle, dense trees behind it, and in almost every drawing a child had sketched something small in the lower corner that I first mistook for a decorative detail. It was a door built into the ground. I didn't sleep well that night. The next Monday I asked, gently and one at a time, whether any child had shared their drawing with another student before handing it in. Every single one said no. I believed them. Children that age are not capable of coordinating that kind of consistency. And their discomfort when I asked how they knew the place was not the discomfort of being caught in a lie. It was something closer to shame, or grief, or both. I started asking the older residents of Denmore about the forest, casually at first, mentioning it in conversation after Sunday Mass or when parents stopped by the school. The responses were remarkably similar. A shift in posture, a slight tightening around the eyes, a quick redirect toward a different topic. One elderly farmer named August told me directly that there was nothing in Halrow Forest worth exploring. He said it pleasantly enough, but his hands were pressed flat against his thighs in a way that told me exactly the opposite. I went to the village records office and asked to see old maps. The clerk, a quiet woman named Edna, brought me two. I noticed she did not offer a third. When I asked about earlier surveys, she told me the older archives had suffered water damage during a flood in 1949. She said it without looking at me. That detailed the flood, the year I wrote it down. I didn't know why yet. I found a reference to Halrow Forest in a church registry from 1943, buried inside a list of donated supplies: blankets, canned goods, medicine, boots in children's sizes. The entry was signed by my predecessor, a sister named Agatha Crane, who had served at the Denmore School for nearly 20 years before me. There was no explanation for the donation or who received it. I asked Father Emmerich, the parish priest, about Sister Agatha. He was quiet for a long moment before telling me she had passed in 1961 and was remembered fondly. Then he changed the subject. I found Sister Agatha's journal in a cedar box stored in the back of the school's supply closet. It was wedged behind hymnals and boxes of chalk. I don't know if it was intentionally hidden or simply forgotten, but reading it changed everything I thought I understood about Denmore. The journal covered the years 1941 through 1947. And what Sister Agatha described in careful and sometimes heartbroken handwriting was this. During the war, Denmore had quietly sheltered a group of displaced families, refugees, mostly women and children, who had been separated from their homes during the forced relocations happening across the border regions. They had traveled on foot for weeks. Sister Agatha had coordinated with 3 village families to hide them in a stone shelter deep inside Halrow Forest, a structure built into the earth decades earlier and used originally for cold storage. The iron gate, the stone archway, the door built into the ground. For nearly 2 years, those families lived in that shelter. The village fed them, clothed them, kept their existence secret. And then, in the winter of 1944, something went terribly wrong. A fire. Small, contained, but enough. 3 people died, and in the chaos of the aftermath, the families were quietly relocated further north, their names removed from any local record to protect both them and the villagers who had sheltered them. Sister Agatha wrote that the community had made a silent agreement afterward. They would not speak of it publicly. The legal risk was still real. The grief was too raw. And so they buried it. But they never forgot. And here was the truth that broke my heart completely open. The parents had told their children, not formally, not with documents or explanations, but in the way parents do when they carry something too heavy to hold alone, in fragments, in warnings. Don't go near the old gate in the forest. There was something important there once. People suffered there. You must remember that, even if you don't understand why. The children had inherited the memory without inheriting the meaning. They knew the place because their parents had quietly passed the coordinates of grief from one generation to the next, not understanding that keeping the secret for so long had transformed a story of extraordinary courage into something that simply felt like fear. Those children were not afraid of something evil. They were afraid of something sacred that no one had ever explained to them. When I brought Sister Agatha's journal to Father Emmerich and laid it open on his desk, he didn't speak for a very long time. Then he told me that he had been a boy of 9 when it happened. He had carried food to the shelter himself, twice, holding his father's hand in the dark. He said that after the fire, his father cried in a way he had never seen before and never saw again, and that his father made him promise not to speak of it, because the pain of the ones who hadn't survived was too large for ordinary words. I understood then that the village hadn't been hiding something shameful. They had been protecting something holy, and the silence had slowly crushed the meaning out of it until even they forgot what they were preserving. Within 2 months of that conversation, I worked with Father Emmerich and 3 of the eldest families to locate 2 surviving descendants of the families who had been sheltered. One woman, living 4 provinces away, cried on the telephone when I described the stone archway. She said her mother had drawn it for her once from memory and told her it was the place where strangers had saved her life. We held a memorial service at the edge of Halrow Forest on a Sunday morning in late spring. We cleared the archway. We placed a simple stone marker. Every family in Denmore came, and when I looked out at those 23 children standing with their parents, I saw something shift in their faces. The weight was still there, but it was different now. It had a name. It had a reason. It wasn't fear anymore. It was memory. And memory, when it's finally allowed to breathe, doesn't destroy people. It holds them together. I spent the rest of that evening sitting alone inside the empty schoolroom with Sister Agatha's journal in my hands, and I allowed myself to cry in a way I hadn't since I was a young girl. Not from sadness, from gratitude. Because those children had done something extraordinary without knowing it. They had carried a story their parents couldn't speak aloud until someone finally came along who was willing to ask the right question and sit still long enough to hear the answer. What I learned in Denmore is something I carry with me every single day. The most frightening secrets are not always frightening because they are dark. Sometimes they are frightening because they are too beautiful and too painful to hold alone, and sometimes the youngest, quietest voices in any community are the ones preserving the most important truths, waiting patiently, faithfully, instinctively for someone to finally be brave enough to listen. Those children saved that story, and that story, once spoken aloud, saved them. I want to ask you something honestly. If you had been standing in that schoolroom looking at 23 identical drawings from children who had never compared notes, would you have kept investigating, or would you have put those drawings in a drawer and told yourself there had to be a simple explanation? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story changed the way you expected it to end, if that final revelation hit you somewhere you didn't see coming, please share it. Because the people who carried this silence for 50 years deserve to be remembered, and so does every quiet act of courage that history almost forgot.